In the spring of 1896, an ethnologist named Frank Hamilton Cushing knelt over a trench of black muck on the western shore of Marco Island, off the Gulf Coast of Florida, and lifted out a carved wooden mask that had not touched open air in roughly 2,000 years. Cushing worked for the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology, and by 1896 he already had a reputation few field ethnologists of his era could match. A decade earlier, he had lived among the Zuni people of New Mexico for nearly 5 years, adopted into the tribe and initiated into one of its priesthoods, developing a method of embedded fieldwork that was unusual for its time and controversial within his own institution. He had come south to Florida with a crew funded jointly by the archaeologist William Pepper and the philanthropist Phoebe Hearst, drawn by reports that a local settler clearing land near a low shell ridge had turned up wood carvings in ground too wet to farm. The settlers called the site the Court of the Pile Dwellers. The 10,000 islands around them were a maze of mangrove and shell ridge with almost no dry ground to speak of, and the crew worked from boats, hauling equipment through channels that flooded and drained with the tide twice a day. What Cushing found beneath the muck was not scattered debris. It was the floor of a settlement, or a temple, or something the written record has never fully settled on a single word for. Painted masks, carved animal effigies, tools with their wooden handles still fitted to stone and shell blades, all of it preserved by a trick of chemistry with almost no equal in North American archaeology. Cushing's formal account of the dig, preliminary report on the exploration of ancient key dweller remains on the Gulf Coast of Florida, reached the American Philosophical Society in 1897. That is the year the discovery entered the written record. What it means has never fully entered the popular one. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What kept the carvings intact was the absence of the one thing that destroys wood everywhere else on Earth: oxygen. The site Cushing excavated had been built on pilings driven into a shallow tidal pond, and when the pond silted over, the timber understructure and everything that had fallen or been placed beneath it sank into an airless black mud that sealed out the bacteria and fungi that normally reduce wood to nothing within a few decades. Tannic acid leaching from the surrounding mangrove roots added a second layer of protection, slowing decay further, a combination of chemistry rare enough that archaeologists still study the Marco Island muck as a case study in what wet site preservation can accomplish. Under those pilings, Cushing's crew recovered close to 1,000 wooden, bone and shell artifacts in a single season: bowls, tablets, netting still knotted the way a fisherman had left it, and carved figures whose craftsmanship startled the men who first laid eyes on them. The most famous of those figures came out of the mud on the 6th of April. A carving of a crouching cat, 6 inches high, its ears back and its spine curved in a posture no untrained hand accidentally gets right. It has been called the Key Marco cat since the day it surfaced, and it now sits behind glass at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, one of the very few objects from that excavation that made it out of Florida whole. Among the pieces Cushing described in the most detail were a set of painted wooden tablets and masks depicting animal and human faces fused together, a face with the beak of a pelican worked into its features, another with what he read as the head of a woodpecker rising from a human brow. He interpreted these as representations of clan or spirit guardians, worn or displayed during ceremonies tied to the fishing seasons the entire regional economy depended on. He based that reading partly on the writings of Father Juan Rogel, a Jesuit missionary who lived among the Calusa at Calos between 1567 and 1569, and left one of the only first-hand European accounts of their religious life. Rogel described masked dancers, carved idols kept inside a structure he called a temple, and priests who claimed to speak for spirits residing in animal form, and he wrote, with evident frustration, that he had failed after 2 years to persuade the Calusa cacique to abandon those practices for Christianity. The correspondence between a written Spanish account from more than 3 centuries earlier and carved objects pulled from mud in the same season, describing the same kind of masked, animal-centered ceremony, is one of the stronger threads of continuity in Florida's pre-contact record. Most of what Cushing found did not survive its own discovery. Wood that has spent 2 millennia in anaerobic mud is not wood anymore in any structural sense. It is a saturated lattice held together by water pressure, and the moment that water begins to evaporate, the lattice collapses. Cushing's team tried to slow the process with wet cloth, ice, and whatever fixatives an 1890s field expedition could carry, but conservation science had not yet caught up to what the mud at Marco Island had preserved. Field notes and later accounts describe carved masks curling and crumbling within days of being lifted from the trench, before a cast could be taken or a photograph properly exposed. Of the roughly 1,000 artifacts recovered that season, a comparatively small number survive today, chiefly at the Smithsonian, the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and the Florida Museum of Natural History. The rest exist only in Cushing's field drawings and in the memory of a dig that ended almost as fast as it began, when the funding provided by Pepper and Hearst ran out after a single extended season. Cushing had intended Marco Island to be the first of several seasons. He returned to Washington that autumn with crates of drawings, photographs, and whatever artifacts had survived transport, planning a full multi-volume account to follow his preliminary report. He never wrote it. Failing health, competing Smithsonian assignments, and finally his death in 1900, left the 1897 report as the only extended account of the dig that Cushing himself completed. The collection sat only partially studied for the better part of a century, until the anthropologist Marion Spute Gilliland undertook a full reanalysis in the 1970s, matching what remained of the physical collection back against Cushing's original field drawings, and publishing her findings as The Material Culture of Key Marco, Florida. A significant portion of what is known today about pieces that no longer survive in any complete physical form comes from that reconciliation of Cushing's century-old sketches against the objects that outlasted them. The site itself did not fare much better than the artifacts. Marco Island, once a mangrove backwater reachable mainly by boat, was subdivided and developed through the middle decades of the 20th century into one of the more heavily built stretches of Florida's Gulf Coast. Condominiums and resort properties now stand over ground Cushing never had the time or funding to fully excavate. What was left unexplored in 1896 is, in practical terms, permanently unexplorable now. Cushing believed, and most archaeologists since have agreed, that the people who built the pile settlement at Marco Island were ancestral to the Calusa, the maritime society that dominated Florida's southwest coast at the time of first Spanish contact in the 1520s. The Calusa did not farm. They built an economy and a political order almost entirely on fish and shellfish and on the engineering of water itself, cutting canals through the mangrove and building shell mounds tall enough to see the Gulf from. At their capital town, a place called Kalos on what is now known as Mound Key in Estero Bay, they raised an artificial harbour enclosed by shell embankments, a private watercourt reserved for the ruling family and reachable only by canal. Similar engineering shows up at Pineland, a Calusa town site north of Sanibel Island that the archaeologist William Marquardt and the University of Florida's Randell Research Center have studied for decades, where canal cuts, shell ridges, and a raised earthwork mound complex reveal the same underlying pattern, a coastal society that treated the manipulation of water and shell on a monumental scale as an ordinary part of building a town. Whether the pile settlement Cushing excavated was itself a temple in any formal sense is a question the surviving evidence cannot fully answer, and the honest position is to say so rather than resolve it for effect. What survives is a religious and ceremonial complex, built on pilings over open water, filled with carved objects whose iconography points toward ritual rather than daily use, occupied for centuries, and abandoned or transformed long before any European or American observer arrived to ask the people living there what it had been. One detail belongs here because it is often left out, and leaving it out flattens the story into something simpler than it actually was. The Seminole people, whose name is now most commonly attached to Florida's indigenous history in the popular imagination, did not build Mound Key, and they did not build the pile settlement at Marco Island. The Seminole descend largely from Creek and other southeastern peoples who migrated into Florida beginning in the 1700s, arriving well after the Calusa world had already collapsed under the weight of Spanish-era disease, raiding, and forced relocation. By the 1760s, organized Calusa society was effectively gone, its last remnant population reported to have left for Cuba. When Seminole communities later settled parts of the Everglades and its margins, they were moving into a landscape already carrying several thousand years of prior occupation by a people whose language and full religious system had already gone silent. No first-hand Seminole account of the Marco Island site or its builders survives in the documented record, and claiming one exists would misstate what the archives actually contain. What the record does contain is a gap, one Florida people's ceremonial world, sealed in mud and partially recovered in 1896, and a different Florida people who arrived generations after that world had already ended. The pile settlement at Marco Island is not the only place in Florida where a structure raised over water sank into mud and waited for an archaeologist to find it. Roughly 90 miles to the northeast, in Glades County near the northern edge of the Everglades Basin, an archaeologist named William Sears spent the 1960s and early 1970s excavating a site called Fort Center, built along Fisheating Creek, where it feeds into Lake Okeechobee. Sears found a large earthwork complex there, embankments, and a great circular ditch, several hundred feet across, enclosing several acres of raised ground, with radiocarbon dates reaching back as early as 450 years before the Common Era, and continued use of the site stretching on for centuries afterward. At the center of the complex was a pond, and at the bottom of that pond, Sears found the remains of a wooden platform that had once stood on pilings above the water. Archaeologists generally place Fort Center within what is called the Belle Glade culture, the name given to the pre-Columbian peoples of the Lake Okeechobee Basin and the northern Everglades, a group whose earthwork and mound-building tradition developed separately from, though in continuous contact with, the coastal Calusa-Hatchie culture that gave rise to the Calusa nearer the Gulf. The Fort Center platform was not a house or a workshop. Sears identified it as a charnel structure, a place where the dead were laid out above the water to decompose before their bones were gathered and carried elsewhere for final burial, a practice called excarnation that appears independently in mortuary traditions on several continents. Carved wooden effigies of birds and other animals, remarkably close in spirit to the carvings Cushing had pulled from the mud at Marco Island 70 years earlier, came out of the same waterlogged deposits, kept whole by the identical absence of oxygen that had protected the key Marco carvings. The platform had collapsed and settled into the pond centuries before Sears arrived, and it had lain there, submerged and intact enough to map, for roughly 2,000 years. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Between Marco Island and Fort Center sits a third site worth naming, if only to show the pattern was not a curiosity confined to two isolated locations. Mound Key itself was excavated across multiple seasons beginning in the 1990s by archaeologists from the University of Florida, who confirmed what those 16th century Spanish missionary accounts had already described. A town built almost entirely from shell fill, its main mound rising more than 30 feet above the surrounding marsh, organized around an interior watercourt cut off from the open bay by constructed embankments, with canals engineered to bring canoes directly into the heart of the settlement. Water was not incidental to how these societies built their most important places. It was the material they built with and, unintentionally, the mechanism by which their most fragile evidence survived at all. Stories about a lost temple beneath the Everglades circulate periodically online, usually attached to a specific date and a supposed indigenous eyewitness that no archive actually contains. Those details do not hold up against the documented record, and repeating them does a disservice to what the record genuinely offers. None of this requires inventing a temple the evidence does not support, and it does not require a witness who never spoke. What the documented evidence supports is stranger, in its way, than an invented account would be: a religious and political culture spanning the Everglades basin and its coastal margins, capable of engineering canals, harbors, and elevated ceremonial platforms out of shell and timber, operating for at least 2,500 years before Spanish contact, and leaving behind a material record that survives today almost entirely by accident, sealed in mud that happened to starve it of the oxygen that destroys everything else. Take away the muck at Marco Island and the pond at Fort Center, and there is almost nothing left of what these people carved, painted, or built to stand over water. The shell and stone endure on their own. The wood needed to drown to last. What remains of the Marco Island collection is scattered now across 3 institutions and a handful of published photographs. The objects Cushing's crew managed to stabilize before the Florida sun took the rest. The key Marco cat is the exception nearly everyone has seen, small enough to overlook the scale of what it represents. An entire ceremonial vocabulary, rendered in wood, surviving in fragments because a settler's plow happened to strike ground too wet to farm. Fort Center's charnel platform survives only as excavation records, drawings, and the recovered effigies now held by the Florida Museum of Natural History. The pond itself long since drained and altered by agricultural development in the decades after Sears completed his fieldwork. Mound Key is the best preserved of the 3, protected today as a Florida state park reachable only by boat, its shell embankments and water courts still legible on the ground for anyone willing to make the trip out into Estero Bay. Digital reconstructions completed in recent years, layering Cushing's original photographs against Gilliland's later catalogue, have let researchers examine pieces that no longer exist in any complete physical form, working from a photographic record of an excavation that itself outlived most of what it dug up. Ongoing fieldwork elsewhere in Calusa territory, including Marquardt's decades of excavation at Pineland, continues to add to a picture Cushing only had a single season to sketch, confirming piece by piece that Marco Island was not an isolated find, but one data point in a much larger coastal civilization that historians are still working to fully map. The gap in the record is not a mystery imposed on the evidence from the outside, it is the evidence. A ceremonial culture with the engineering capacity to build harbors and elevated mortuary platforms out of shell and timber left almost no trace of its religious life anywhere the ground stayed dry, because wood does not survive open air for 2,000 years under any circumstances anywhere on Earth. It survives only where water sealed it away from the air that destroys it, and only for as long as that seal holds. Every masked face and carved animal effigy that reached a museum shelf did so because a pond, a tidal pool, or a drowned ceremonial floor happened to keep it wet for 2 millennia, and because an archaeologist happened to find it before the water table shifted or the land was sold. The objects that speak now are the ones that got lucky. Everything found and lost before anyone thought to photograph it is not absent from history because it never existed. It is absent because the 2 conditions required to preserve it, permanent submersion and a timely excavation, rarely both occur in the same place at the same time. Frank Hamilton Cushing died in 1900, 4 years after his season at Marco Island, without ever returning to finish the excavation he had started. The site he opened sits today beneath streets and swimming pools on one of Florida's more expensive stretches of coastline, and whatever remains buried there will very likely stay buried, not because anyone is hiding it, but because there is no longer any undeveloped ground left to dig. What Cushing pulled from that trench in the spring of 1896, and what William Sears found 70 years later in a drained pond 90 miles to the northeast, is the closest thing the documented record offers to a temple beneath the Everglades. Not a single lost structure waiting to be rediscovered whole, but a scattered, waterlogged, half-destroyed record of a religious world that once stood at the edge of the water on purpose, and that very nearly vanished the moment it was finally brought back into the light. No single date and no single witness can carry the full weight of what these sites actually document. It took 2 excavations, 70 years apart, and the slow, unglamorous work of archivists like Gilliland, matching a dead man's field sketches against a shrinking museum collection, to put together even the partial picture that survives now. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.